At a town hall event in New Hampshire yesterday, Donald Trump managed to outdo himself with this interaction with a supporter concerning Muslims, training camps, and President Obama's heritage. Let's watch.
Okay, this man, I like this guy.
I'm from White Plains. Amen. Okay? We have a problem in this country. It's called Muslims. We know our current president is one.
Right.
You know he's not even an American.
We need this
Birth
question.
certificate, man. But anyway, we have training camps growing where they want to kill us.
Mm-hmm.
That's my question. When can we get rid of
We're going to be looking at a lot of different things. And, you know, a lot of people are saying that, and a lot of people are saying that bad things are happening out there. We're going to be looking at that and plenty of other things.
Yeah, so that's Donald Trump supporting a call for ethnic cleansing. That's what that is, right? So that's like that's kind of genocidal, him. And so I've been saying this all along, that the media won't call what he's doing racism. And if they do, they quickly correct themselves, which I've seen happen on MSNBC. And they won't call what he's doing fascism. They won't say, hey, this is classic fascism. And you see the appeal of it. There's a charismatic leader. He whips up people's hatred towards the other. The other is also always people with no money and no power in a society which have been marginalized. He appeals to nativism. All these things, misogyny is a big part of a hallmark also of fascism. So it's funny to watch the news media trip all over themselves to cover this guy and not piss him off because he gets them ratings, and at the same time not accurately describe what he's doing. Chris Hayes will describe accurately on Twitter what he's doing, but then he'll cut to a live feed for 40 minutes and watch him do and spew his fascist, racist bullshit on his TV show.
100%.
So let me just say two quick things over that. One, again, you replace Muslim with Jew, and you cannot make an argument that it's not fascist, right? There's a problem in the country. It's called the Jews. When do we get rid of them? That's not like an exaggeration. It's not a hyperbole. That's fascism 101. Okay, that is textbook fascism. Okay, so
and he's talking about rounding people up. He's literally talking about rounding up 11, 12 million people. A lot of them sin more than that because he wants citizens gone too.
Yeah, and the only question is, do they do that or the illegal immigrants first?
Yes.
They have a long list of groups that need to be rounded up and then carted out, or just killed.
And so, but Joe Scarborough will still giggle it up like a schoolgirl with him every fucking morning because he'll get ratings for it, and he doesn't. And they all consider they all, you know, I don't know if you watch, but I do. I'm up late. I like to go to bed angry, so I watch Morning Joe, and that's what they're all doing. They're all giggling. Hey, Donald, thanks for coming on. And every time he says something ridiculous, like when he said that about Rand Paul, I didn't make fun of your appearance, and there's a lot, and people fucking laughed in the audience. Now those aren't. Who are those people? All those people are in suits in the audience, and they're laughing at Donald Trump doing the most despicable thing.
Yeah.
Rand Paul just articulates why what he's doing is dragging the whole party down and debasing the whole process, and then he does it immediately, and then everyone laughs. I mean, it's...
So that leads perfectly into point number 2, which is that Hitler would have gotten great ratings.
Great. Still today, that's why they run him. There should be a Hitler channel, which the History Channel kind of is.
Okay, no, because if they had the kind of ratings in the cable news in Germany that we have now, Hitler was enormously popular. Remember?
Enormous. He always said outrageous things.
That's right. And boy, he would have rated, and you know what he'd have done in the debates? He'd have killed them, literally. Right?
Yeah. Yes.
And he'd have come out super strong to round them up. They're the ones causing the problems. God, he would have rated so well, and everybody would have. What would they have done? They would have genuflected
and jumped on his lap on his helicopter, and Mark Halperin would have tweeted out a photo of him with Hitler on his jet. Hey,
and the thing is, I mean, like that guy who stood up there and said this and doesn't realize that he is an incipient Nazi. Basically, he doesn't realize that. He didn't just come from nowhere.
Right.
Like the conditions had to be prepared to produce people like that.
Exactly.
And that can happen sort of accidentally. Your country can be invaded, your economy can be destroyed, and then you produce a generation of authoritarians who will bow down to anyone who will give them food and shelter. That has happened in history. But America hasn't had that. I mean, that guy was what, 40 years old? Look, we weren't in terrible shape 40 years ago. No, but you do have one party that their economic policies will, as a necessity, by their design, destroy the economy after 5 to 8 years, which we saw in the 2000s. And then at the same time, before, during, and after that, they will pave the way by continually trumping up the idea that you can blame every problem you have from your job, you can't get a job, to, oh, the military doesn't look cool enough anymore, or you can't get it up in the bedroom. Every single problem you have can be traced back to some out-group. And you just put all of your hatred onto them, and then if we just kick them out, then everything will be great. And you do those two things, and the GOP has done everything they can over the past 60 or plus years to do that, and then you get that guy.